Bueno, bienvenidos a todos. Espero que estén bien, buenas tardes, y que hayan podido activar los subtítulos. En un momento vamos a empezar con la charla. Eh, Bienvenidos a esta última conferencia del ciclo Frankfurtianas de este año 2024. Como ustedes ya deben saber, el ciclo Frankfurtianas está organizado desde el programa Lectura Mundi, eh, cuya directora es Micaela Cuesta, que está acá presente con nosotros, y pertenece a la Secretaría de Comunidad, Cultura y Territorio de la Universidad de San Martín, cuyo director es Mario Greco, así que gracias a él y también a todo el equipo de la Secretaría que hizo posible que hoy tengamos esta charla y que esté Eva von Redecker con nosotros. Bueno, este ciclo, si ustedes tienen el interés de explorarlo un poco más y- y saber qué estuvimos haciendo, eh, tenemos disponibles, a ver, tengo que buscar el chat porque les quiero pasar la página del ciclo Frankfurtianas como para que ustedes puedan acceder a todas las charlas que hicimos y de esa manera eh, poder ver todo lo que hicimos durante este año y durante el año pasado, que son una serie de conferencias en las que estuvo, por ejemplo, Sara Speck al principio de año, Florencia Badi, Romina Conti, Julia Espósito, Gisela Catanzaro también estuvo con nosotros, Mariana Dimopoulos, Lucía Wegelen y Natalia Tacheta. Entonces, ahí en la página que les acabo de pasar por el chat van a poder acceder a todas esas charlas. Bien. Antes de empezar, quería saber si todos pudieron setear bien los subtítulos. ¿Sí? Bueno, perfecto. Bueno, les voy a presentar a Eva entonces. Eva es filósofa y escritora de no ficción que vive en una zona rural de Brandenburgo, en Alemania. Su último libro es Freiheit o algo así, que significa la libertad de quedarse. Y en ese libro aborda la idea de la libertad en una clave temporal, como disfrute del tiempo pleno, principalmente, pero bueno, después ella nos va a explicar qué otras claves del tiempo están ahí pensadas, ¿no? La precuela a este texto es La Revolución por la Vida, que, que bueno, salió en el 2020 originalmente y acá en Argentina se editó en el 2022, y ofrece una interpretación unificadora de las luchas anticapitalistas contemporáneas. Los escritos de Eva han aparecido en The Guardian, Die Zeit, Le Monde Diplomatique y como columna habitual en Philosophy Magazine. La tesis doctoral de Eva se publicó en inglés con el título Praxis y Revolución, una teoría social de los cambios radicales. Salió publicada en el 2021 por la Universidad de Columbia, por la editorial de la Universidad de Columbia, y sus obras están traducidas a una docena de idiomas. Eva también imparte clases o ha impartido clases en la Universidad Humboldt de Berlín y en la New School de Nueva York, y fue becaria de María Skłodowska-Curie en la Universidad de Verona. Hoy va a presentar esta charla cuyo título es La libertad de quedarse sobre la emancipación en el Antropoceno. So, with no further introduction, I present you Eva von Redecker. Eva, it's a pleasure for us to have you here in our university, so welcome.
Thank you so much, Pablo. It's a great honor to be speaking here. Thank you for the invitation also to Michaela. And yeah, amazing. Thanks for everyone who joined. I hope you can hear me well. I hate speaking slow, but I will try not to be too fast. Um, also, sorry, it's a bit dark. It's really late where I am. And after the talk, before the questions, I probably have to get up to put more wood on the fire because it's also frost outside. I will, and isn't it beautiful that this bloody extractivist technology allows us to come together in this way rather than me flying? I will talk about this notion that Pablo already mentioned, the freedom to stay, and what I mean by that. And it's, it really came out of a reckoning with this mind-boggling situation that you in Argentina will know much more about than I do, but the fact that the new wave of fascism around the globe, but sort of spearheaded in Argentina, is operating and mobilizing around the concept of freedom. So, like, it's not only that somehow we don't get enough momentum on the left for freedom and liberation, it's that actually this has become a rallying cry for the right, definitely since the COVID crisis in our hemisphere, but there are also many other constellations that have made, where repeatedly the appeal to freedom has worked for the other side. And I don't think we can let go of that concept. It's something that I occasionally hear from young, especially climate activists around here in Germany, that they say, look, if our freedom is just, it's just burnt, it's broken, it's just a term of fascism now. We just have to think about survival. And I think that's a catastrophe. Like, it's like if politics are not centered on freedom anymore, we've lost perhaps the only precious bit of enlightenment and modernity. And I don't think the concept anyway is sort of exclusive to those historical developments. Plus, I think it's a misunderstanding of what kind of creatures, what kind of animals humans are. So we always are free in a certain way. There is no survival that isn't also entailing questions of freedom. You always decide whether and how to survive. I think it's also a very important point for some to make as a feminist who doesn't think that reproductive labor and life are somehow the antithesis and the other of freedom. Even if you kind of breastfeed a baby as a human animal, you can decide to do it this way or that way, or there are many options. Always freedom, and our political struggle should be on how to universalize and maximize that freedom. But for the first half of the talk, I'll now do, in a way, the most predictable thing in a lecture dedicated to the Frankfurt School. I'm doing what they always do, have always done since Marx, or actually Hegel, and that is criticizing the liberal negative notion of freedom. The only thing that is sort of maybe that I have to add is to do it in a slightly different way, because I think already the idea that negative freedom is correctly described as such, as just the absence of coercion, to which we then have to, usually the argument goes in the Frankfurt School, we have to add the positive freedom, a social freedom, on top of the negative liberal freedom. I think that's already buying into liberalism too much. In fact, negative freedom is never just determined negatively. It's not just the absence of coercion. It's always modeled on the modern institution of property. So negative freedom is mediated by property. I'm going to get back to that. And then the other thing that I'm going to do differently is that the positive freedom I'm after is actually not so much the social freedom, not because I don't think that's important, but I think that's been done. There are good theories, both in feminism and in social philosophy, on positive social freedom, but ecological freedom. And I think we really don't yet have, I mean, maybe you have, and then I'm happy to learn, but in the discourses I'm raised in, we don't have a good notion of positive ecological freedom. And I think it's something that we sort of need to work with if we want to hold on to this notion of freedom. So that's just sort of as to know where to map my talk in this sort of arena of theory. Now it's going to be a bit more closer to the phenomena or narrative. So what I think we witness at this moment in time is a real breaking apart of liberal freedom. So in some sense, we don't even need to criticize it anymore. It's just broken, It's broken, but not just in some random way. But I think it's broken in the two pieces that have always uneasily constituted it. So what was liberal freedom? Liberal freedom, when it works, has two components. There is the component of volition, of being allowed to do whatever one wants to do, thanks to the fact that one is owning oneself, as long as one doesn't infringe on the spheres of volition of the others, who are equally entitled to freedom. So modern liberal freedom always has those two components, the volition and the barrier, or the respect for the barrier of where the freedom of the others starts. Only together do they make sense, because if you just have the volition, you would think then you have chaos and state of nature, as the early theorists would say. But there is also a kind of trust in all liberal theorists that, there is some part of your activities and your existence that only concerns you, and where you can truly just do whatever you want. And then there are some things that we need to regulate, and that's what law and the state is there for, and politics is there for. But I think what has happened over the last years is that this joint has just become unhinged. So we have those two parts of freedom almost like floating around separately. There is on the one hand, there is the possessive part, this idea that I can do whatever I want. And there are arenas there are also outer arenas in which I can act out that entitlement. And somehow that side has stopped caring at all for the idea that there is such a thing as reason and restraint to coordinate my freedom with the freedom of the others. So we have a sort of unhinged possessive entitlement, the volition without the barrier or the constraint of reason. And actually, it's not even true to say it doesn't care about the barrier or the kind of freedom of the other. Often I feel it's what really fuels right-wing discourse is that the freedom is felt in the moment where the other can be violated. So even with like freedom of speech, a certain group of people only feel that they're free, their speech is free, if they can actually humiliate and violate somebody, because then, then it was really free. It was not what the other wanted to hear. And I mean, we see this crazy effect. I don't know how it's globally, but in Europe, that we're now at 38% of new cars that are bought are SUVs, and actually in the production is even over 50%. So those absurdly big cars. I think part of their attraction is that everybody knows that we're on the last meters of fossil combustion, and that there is a real kind of sense of aggression in even driving those things. But that's what's selling them. And obviously, I don't need to even start telling you about the chainsaw as the symbol of this kind of unhinged possessive freedom that finds its fulfillment in the ultimate prerogative of ownership destruction. So you're only free if you really own something, and you only know that you really own it if you may also destroy it, because then there was no constraint or no limit. So that's the one-sided part of freedom that is sort of broken off from liberal freedom. And I think then we have the other end, which is sort of just a kind of hollow, the kind of husk, the shell of freedom, because it's only the consideration for the equal right of the other, or it's only the concern about drawing the constraints and the barriers correctly. And every sort of sensible left liberal emancipatory movement or political stance in the last decades would often fall into a tone of understanding that we have to give up some of our actions, some of our consumption, even some of our ways of speaking, ways of making love, ways of using land, lots of kind of entitlements that have come rightly under scrutiny, because after all, it turned out they do impinge on the rights of others. So we've learned so much about how, even my breath can infect the body of somebody else. My language can shape their identity. So there's very little left that doesn't have an effect on others. So there is an ever-increasing demand on reflecting on where to draw the boundaries of not hurting the freedom of others. And then, of course, with the whole ecological question, that also has the dimension of, my mobility hurting the life in the future, also in other geological regions. So there is this sort of right and justified attempt to readjust the boundaries, but it's also, it's not really fun, and it's also not really making you feel free, because there's very little sort of left of real kind of celebratory freedom. And I sometimes use this image, when I say liberal freedom is broken, you can imagine, when you have a glass bottle, you break a glass bottle, you have two pieces. One piece, it still holds water, that's the bottom piece. But the other piece, that's the one you can fight with, where you have the neck of the bottle. And then if you have a broken bottle, that's a great tool. And, we got the wrong end as left liberals, and the right has the other end. So that's obviously just an image, but it sort of helps with the idea. So now, in critical theory, of course, if something is broken, that's not always bad news, because we have often a crisis theory of sort of dialectical development. And you would think, well, great, maybe this is the contradiction in liberal freedom, so we can finally surmount and overcome it. And unfortunately, I do not think that this coming apart of liberal freedom has the shape of a dialectical contradiction. I think it actually has a shape that Gillian Rose, British critical theorist, has called diremption. So it's not a contradiction, but a diremption. And the German Hegel is Entzweiung. So the figure is the coming apart of two things that were not originally one. So the figure of dialectics is often something that shares a root, and then it seems contradictory, but it's actually the same thing. But so Gillian Rose's example for diremption actually is a marriage. When you have a divorce, the two things break apart from a unit, but obviously they at some point before were two separate things. So they only met at some point. So that's diremption. And yet, for instance, for a child of that divorce, it might look as if an originary unity is breaking apart.
Well, I don't know where you are from, but I still see people wearing masks. They say numerous masks. A lot of times when you buy masks, you got to buy them. They don't.
Cristian,
I guess you buy them individually, but every time I bought them, they come in boxes. So
I think
Just a minute.
as a host, you can shut them down. Yeah.
Okay.
And I think that's actually not a bad analogy for what happens with liberal freedom, where for those who were kind of at the privileged end of the democratic modern capitalist progress in the sort of centers, it might look as if those things really had held together and we had functioning democracies with a somewhat reasonable public sphere. But for others, those that were excluded from that conversation or that were working under conditions that made it more or less impossible to even contribute with an equal voice, then those two parts of liberal freedom have never really stuck or held together. And that brings me to the first of three, I think, points why I think it cannot be repaired. We can't put those two sides back together. We shouldn't try to find a glue that sort of overcomes the divorce. So the first, I already sort of touched but didn't properly explain. So I do think in the real history of liberal democracy, which was mostly aligned with capitalism, it was never the case that everybody equally was a barrier to each other's freedom. There were always groups that were not seen as owning themselves and therefore not sort of being granted the respect of an owner and of somebody who can act their volition. So indigenous people were seen as non-owners and then deprived and brutally deprived of their land, often also of their lives in genocides. People who were working under bad conditions, of course, in the extreme case, under slavery, were not barriers to someone else's freedom. They were the outer kind of ground on which the owners, the white supremacists, could live out their freedom. And I mean, we had this image of the marriage in Gillian Rose, but if you look at actual marriage law, so in Europe it would be in the 19th century, then the husband actually wasn't just the owner of himself, he was the owner of himself and part of the life of the woman, that he owned the reproductive labor of the woman, not the whole woman unless she was actually enslaved, but there was part of the other person that was not a barrier to the freedom of the one possessive subject, but that was the playing field of the freedom. And in that way, then one would have to say that some people were sort of barriers that were there to be taken down and not barriers that were there to be respected for the few properly endowed possessive individuals. So those who were possessive individuals always already had some ownership claim, some arena of ownership outside themselves, be it in real property or be it in the lives of subjugated people or women, and others weren't full members. So that's already a bit of, it makes you suspicious about the idea that it was so unevenly distributed. But of course, one could say, well, yeah, that was the past, and now everybody has proper rights to personhood, and now we're all emancipated and we're all self-owners. So great, come some way. And I think, so one way in which this is internally self-defeating is that we have got nowhere closer to overcoming the domination of nature, and also that sort of we've not overcome the subjugation of labor power as owned by the society at large and the capitalist for his enrichment specifically. But also that it just seems to be the case that if you have emancipation in this non-socialist way, in a non-material way, but just on the level of sort of legal entitlement, somehow the old inequality always comes back to bite, because the ones who were privileged, at least some of them, feel that there was some amputation. They've lost their freedom. That's how the freedom breaks apart, that some men think that now they've lost their freedom to, be proper men and be able to have a family in the way that they are the owning part in it and have access to women's bodies. And though this anxiety of losing a certain arena of your freedom precisely drives right-wing campaigns. So it seems that there's something in self-ownership that we, as soon as we try to realize it more broadly, we have precisely this effect that I started out for the idea of breaking apart. A lot of people rather become fascists than equals. So we have a kind of political problem there. Of course, then one could say, yeah, tough. Then we have to just make sure we win, right? Those people, they make a mistake there, and our mobilizing should be stronger and insist on the reasonableness of the idea of universalizing self-ownership. But I think there is something that is a sort of deeply held belief in critical theory that proves right again and again, and that's the idea that there's always a grain of truth in ideology. And there is actually a grain of truth in the idea that if we fully and properly took account of the equality of the self-ownership and the entitlement to freedom of all people involved, globally, even maybe in the future, that then there is hardly anything left that we can do now, or we would have to give up a lot of our ways of our habits, our ways of consuming. Somehow it would seem like a huge sort of closing in of possibility. It's really not how we would like to think of emancipation. I mean, it's, it should be more possibility. And I think that's inbuilt in this idea of liberal freedom, as that already Marx complained about, where you can never think freedom in another way than as pertaining to the individual and ending where the other individual starts. And then if you take in nature, we still haven't solved, okay, so if humans are equal, how do we then protect nature from us? Because that's not a subject with rights. I could say something in discussion of why, of course we could, why I think self-ownership for nature doesn't exactly work. And this is the point at which I think it does make sense to make a slightly more dialectical move and do look at what those both sides, so the side of possessive entitlement, the side of kind of ever greater restraint, what they share. And I think they share the grammar of liberal freedom that is time blind. So we always have a spatial imaginary of, you know, what I can do, my freedom to move, my freedom to kind of grab and own and hold title over, my freedom to put my volition. Hegel always uses it in this very spatial metaphorical way. I put my will onto something, like as if it was a playing field where I put my my stamp or something. Or I can't put my will there because there's already the claim of someone else. But it's as if it was taken from a bird's eye view, just a kind of snapshot of a moment. It's always like a playing field. So liberal freedom actually is a geometric, spatial, imaginary. And it's clear that if you take out time, if you freeze the playing field, then other people, or also nature or whatever, it can, but especially other people endowed with rights, they can only ever seem like roadblocks to you. They're only ever something that stands in your way. Because if you freeze time, then they don't move, they block your way. As soon as you think that the story and the history goes on, of course, several options open up. They might attack you. It's even worse than just blocking your way. But they might also help you. There might be solidarity. You might be cooperating to fulfill each other's needs. But you really don't know at the moment where you freeze time and the others are just there. So I think in order to exit this sort of geometric, frozen, but also broken framework of liberal freedom, we need to introduce another dimension into it, and that's the dimension of time. One could already think of it, one could already glimpse it in some of the resistance of sort of what we would usually think of as maybe not the most radical emancipation movements. So somebody, for instance, environmental protesters who block your way. We just had an action here in Berlin last night where they try to block the gas lobbyists to go into a very posh hotel in Berlin. So then, you know, they glue themselves to the ground and they seem to be just stopping the traffic or the people from doing what they want. So it's just a kind of stopping of the movement. But you could also say it's not that those people just want to sort of stop something. They want to enable life in the future. So they're blocking, they're insisting that they stay there is actually something that opens up a whole new promise of life. And I think why I like this formulation of the freedom to stay is that in a spatial view, it seems the 0 point of freedom, like nothing moves, like you just stay, you know, it's really boring. What are you doing? You're doing nothing. But in time, staying is the full promise of existence and thriving. Like if you can stay over time, then apparently your existence was secured. Nobody did attack you. The ground beneath your feet didn't sort of get flooded, or you could stay. It's actually quite demanding over time. It requires a lot of social and ecological conditions. So that's the kind of hinge or the way in which I want to use this this idea of there being such a thing as the temporal freedom to stay rather than the kind of liberal spatial freedom to move, to test out how we could think about freedom in time rather than space. And of course, you could now take a sharp turn and do what, for instance, Martin Hägglund does and say, yes, sure, freedom is temporal. And when is time free? When I own it. And I think that's actually a mistake. That's not what free time means, because it just reintroduces the possessive individual one step further in the game, but it keeps this kind of rather bleak picture of individual controlling units. So time that I own would be, and control, it's often very empty, you know. It happens to me very rarely, but I also don't find it so desirable that I fully control my time. I mean, you need to have definitely, you know, no children, not too many friends and lovers, no political movement. And then you have a sort of Saturday afternoon where you can own your time. But actually, very often we feel most alive when our time is taken out of our hands. So, you know, a mobilization that suddenly works. You don't control it. You don't control whether the generals strike, whether the others take part or not. But suddenly there is this completely enhanced agency. I mean, more privately, one could also say falling in love, you know, you kind of completely lose the control over your time. But suddenly, you know, everything seems possible. So I think ownership is not what makes time free. So we need to look for other criteria. And because it is clear that just having time is not enough. Like, you know, you can have a really shitty unfree time. So it's not in itself a sufficient qualifier for freedom. And so in the book, I have a kind of long, more phenomenological account where the solution to the riddle is that I think we need 3 different qualities of time for life to be free, human life to be free. And I'll just give you at least a little sketch. The first is sort of sounds boring. It's just a linear time of being alive. So I do think that that's crucial, and that not just from knowing about our death, but also from existing, we have the condition of being free. And that it is a hugely important political question of whether lives are foreshortened sort of unnecessarily due to social conditions. So, well, we're in the midst of an unfolding genocide, so that's the most drastic example, but even sort of more slow violence that, for instance, ecological degradation, that attacks some lives, affects some lives more than others, is actually a deprivation of freedom. Here in Germany, I can never believe why that statistic isn't enough to make a revolution. We have 11 years discrepancy between the lives of lower class men, working class men, and sort of middle class bourgeois men. So 11 years of like statistically difference of that time of life. So I think that's a huge problem for freedom. So one should also, so when we speak about emancipation in a temporal vein, I think the first struggles would be precisely the liberation of lifetime, you know, of safeguarding that people are not socially unjust conditions deprived of some of their statistical sort of expectation of a full life. Of course, then still, you know, accidents happen, but also, yeah, in some workplaces are prone to accidents much more than others. So that's the first, it's a linear time that we have as human creatures because we actually know that our life is finite. It's very special amongst animals. But this doesn't sound very much like ecstatic freedom yet, right? Because then you make freedom temporal and the first thing you learn is you're going to die. So there needs to be something else to fulfill this sort of striving for infinity that, you know, other people seek by wanting to have freedom to move all the way to Mars or something. But I think there is actually an infinity in time as well, because we don't just have this linear time towards death. We also have the spontaneous or initiative full time, or the time of potentiality, because as Hannah Arendt would say, we are born with new beginnings and therefore able to ourselves make new beginnings. So there's a second type of time that I would say is more like, time funning out, so branching off in lots and lots of different potentialities, which I would call the fulfilled time, like time where you can, on your own account, start new things. Actually, you can, even if it's on your own account, you can start more things the more other people are there. Like, you need interaction partners to start something. You need a world that is alive and rich around you. And the more occasion will be there for you to choose how to fulfill your own time. And of course, the kind of biggest obstacle to spontaneity is domination. So Hannah Arendt herself was very good on political domination with the extreme case of totalitarianism. She wasn't, shall we say, the most alert to social domination and to the ways in which you sort of structurally your time can just be seen as being owed to somebody else, to caring for somebody else, or to being deferential to other people. So only when structural domination is ended, will there be equal opportunity for fulfilled time for all. So a lot of emancipation struggles are actually struggles against this foreclosure of spontaneity. I mean, if you're under someone else's will, you can never just start something new. You always are afraid. And actually, in that way, very much like you have it in Hegel with the master-slave dialectic, even the dominator is not free to full spontaneous potential. Of course, nobody needs to pity them or like now in my example, me, because if my freedom and sort of comfort relies on having fortress borders around the European continent, then a lot of stuff has to keep going and isn't sort of at the disposal for acting otherwise to safeguard that. So the dominator is actually relying on the continuation of violence, and the violence always, it needs resources, all this concrete and all the police and all the money that goes into those borders that then ethno-nationalists would think secure our freedom, that's massive. And actually it makes us less free, because it also binds the possibility of spontaneity. Only if everyone's free, you don't need to constantly ensure the oppression of others. Is your spontaneity sort of fearless and true? But most people anyway are at this historical moment are not really thinking about how to realize their fullest potential, but rather thinking about how to get by at all and how to, for instance, just get enough sleep. So Hannah Arendt is very good on this new beginning and, being born anew, but actually nobody gives birth to themselves. And you need a lot of things to be there in the world for anybody to have the capacity to use their spontaneity or their initiative. So humans, as everything else in nature, need to recover, to regenerate in order to have any agency at all. And it's pretty spectacular. And again, sort of world historically new that we've managed not just to exhaust and deplete some people, but that we've managed to really undercut the ability, fossil capitalism has managed to really undercut the ability of the whole planetary ecosphere to regenerate itself. So a lot of things that all political theory as we know it takes for granted as background conditions, nobody, like Locke wouldn't worry about, is there enough air to breathe? Like, it's just there. But a lot of those, will it not be too hard for people to even spend their days outside? But all of those ecological processes of the regeneration of life and the livelihood are in a new way need to be at the center of our attention, because they're critically endangered. And the time of nature or the time of regeneration is not, it's not linear, it's also not sort of fanned out, it's actually cyclical. So because it happens in metabolisms. It's not cyclical in the way that sort of old philosophy of nature sometimes thinks of it as completely automatically boring and identical. It's not that nothing ever happens in nature. Actually, there is a history of evolution, but what evolution has done beautifully and up to the end of the Holocene, so in the last 11,000 years, is bring about the richest and most diverse ecosphere we ever had on this planet, with many different niches and ecosystems that all could be described as ensembles of lots and lots of cyclical time or of regenerative cycles locking into each other. I usually call this cyclical time tides. It's because I come from the sea, or because of having Shakespeare, times and tides are out of joint. So tides is sort of time that is always recurring, or that's going through two poles, but always going back and forth. And I think one way to have a materialist reconstruction of nature is to say that it consists in lots of metabolical tides that need to interlock in the right way in order to keep happening. So ecosystem breakdown is usually that those temporal spans of regeneration actually desynchronize. It's not that just something falls out, but it's that, you know, it's sort of warm too early, and then the trees start flowering, but there is frost once more, and then they will have no harvest because all the flowers were burned by the frost. Or it gets too dry too early, so the swallows, which anyway need more time to build their nests when it's dry because they don't find mud, have their babies at a time when there are already no mosquitoes anymore because the mosquitoes need the wetness. And then even though you had mosquitoes earlier, they're not there when the swallow babies need them, and then they die. So this sort of desyncing of tides is a way to capture what the ecological breakdown is. And there again, I think the emancipatory movement to overcome this loss of world would be one that not just sort of protects nature, but tries to understand how to assist and uphold and repair as many as possible, but definitely the most crucial ways of tides, sort of ways of natural self-regeneration. So this sort of regenerative time, it's almost like it's the labor of nature that we need to liberate if we want to live freely as humans. Because, you know, the more scarcity there is, obviously the less freedom there is. So if we have a more abundant ecosphere, we can choose much more, you know, how we want to eat, what we want to eat, what else we do, the better the ecosystems sustain themselves. If you don't have to pollinate your apple trees by hand, then you have also much more time to do other things, you know, and then just bare survival. So those three times or temporalities have to come together for life to be free. And I think we can map social struggles as being taking place in several or even all of them at the same time. And just to close with one sentence on utopia, in some sense, this freedom to stay is like such a depressing, most minimal utopia. And that is maybe actually apt to our historical moment, that in a way it just says, you know, just stay there, you know, don't die out. That's it. So it's like no more than human rights, you know. I mean, usually in a socialist tradition, we want more. But again, at our, like given the political violence around, giving the 6th mass extinction, maybe just stay is already already mobilizing. However, if you fill this freedom to stay in as the fulfillment of, you know, abundant lifetime, fulfilled abundant initiative of time, and finally abundant possibility to recover and regenerate, then it actually becomes a pretty rich picture, and it's a bigger utopia. It's actually a utopia in which we could share time without losing it, and also even share time and thereby recreate time. So I'll stop stealing your time now, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you, Eva. It was nice to hear you, and it was a very interesting presentation. And we also have read your books, and we appreciate your ideas about how to make a critical theory nowadays. But well, I'm going to talk in Spanish now, so I can speak with the others about the possibility of making questions or something like that. Bueno, terminó la presentación de Eva. Estamos abriendo ahora un momento de preguntas, así que cuando quieran levanten la mano o preséntense, abran el micrófono, pueden hacer las preguntas que quieran. Aquellos que puedan hacerlas en inglés, siéntanse libres de hacerlas en inglés, si no, haré yo un esfuerzo por traducirlas. Pero bueno, cuando quieran pueden empezar. O si no, en todo caso, empezaré yo con alguna que tenga, o Micaela también, seguramente. Pero bueno, abrimos el espacio a que todos participen. A ver, ¿alguien que quiera participar? Well, so I can start to break the ice. As you know, I have read your book, Revolution for Life. You know, we had a presentation here in a congress.
Yes,
of,
I saw it.
No, I told
Thank you
you.
so much for doing that.
Okay, so that was a wonderful reading. To be honest, I like more the theoretical part than the political part, you know? And
I hope it, yeah.
And you know why? Because when I first read about this idea, your critique to the concept of property and the phantom property and that kind of word that you made in the 20s, 2020, something like that. I remember that I read your first text about that in that year. So I think it's really important to make this critique because it takes an idea that is also on Marx when you think that the social relationship of production and the idea of profit behind that is the time, the idea of time, the social time to produce something is already there, and it's something really strange that the critical theory doesn't thought about this earlier, you know, earlier in the century or something like that, or maybe there's a lot of things writing about this, and I don't know, but you can enlighten us about that. But the other part, I think, is I didn't. It didn't convince me because we have this idea of a time that is, well, you said the liberal idea of liberty is broken. Wendy Brown will say this is a Frankenstein neoliberalism. You have, for example, Wolfgang Streeck will say this is the time when the alliance between the state and democracy and capitalism is broken. So this is it's like a crazy time when you can find a way to get through these problems we are facing nowadays. No, and like making a compendium, you know, of the different kinds of movements that are fighting capitalism today, it loses the idea of how to articulate all of that. And I want to know if you have any thought about that. You know, the time where these problems get into a political movement, or that it really takes the problem seriously. For example, in the book, you talk about that phrase of Greta Thunberg when she says, well, you don't understand climate change, because if you understand it, you wouldn't be able to live your normal lives, you know? And it's also, I linked that idea with the example, the statistical example that you mentioned here, that the difference between the years of life within lower class people in Germany and upper class, no? And I keep on thinking, how do you think that political moment, when all of this could make sense to start a revolution for life, you know? But I don't know if I'm being clear, but that is my question.
Yeah. So anyway, it's great. I'm of course very grateful to also hear about what you think about Revolution for Life, like as you just did. Obviously, I wanted to present you with the newer stuff, which isn't translated, but it's not like I'm bored by the old. And yeah, I appreciate that you like the first half of Revolution for Life better than the second. I think the first half, hopefully, also doesn't age as quickly, because I mean, if it's an analysis of capitalism, I mean, either it's wrong, which of course it might very well be, but it has to hold for at least like 2 centuries or something. But if the analysis of the movements, of course, is a very thin moment. It's sort of, I would still think it wasn't too wrong in 2020. And I think I still think it's true that we see a new concentration of mobilizing around this concept of life. And that I think it's also true to say that those movements have a different shape than both kind of classical socialist movements and civil rights movements. I mean, for starters, they're not about civil rights, they're somehow about something else. And I try to articulate or translate or summarize some of the ways that several branches of this movement describe themselves. And I think you were looking for something that I feel we might not need. So I don't think these movements need to all be one movement in order to be effective. They could attack capitalism from many sides at once. And I do think it's interesting that we have a lot of movements against what I call dominion or phantom possession in the sort of different areas of propertization and objectivation, while it's so hard to have a proper movement against social inequality. And I think maybe from the side of fighting for lots of different sort of aspirations to life of groups, you might still eventually get to the question of inequality afresh. Maybe that's a hope. But what has happened now is that I think in one sense, I'm still right that the question of life, if anything, has become more central. And it's also, if you look at how the pro-Palestinian movement has sort of entered full world historical stage now, it was from the first day around genocide. And I mean, partly, of course, just because that was true, but it is also a choice. I mean, you could have had a much broader coalition by arguing for, international law, human rights, I mean, but this grammar of saying life is at stake, that this is about femicide, this is against sort of police violence, it's homicide, it's about ecocide, now this is about genocide. I think it follows that same grammar of life, though what we're now seeing also, I think, is a switch in it depends where you look, but there is also now a lot of the radical movements are somewhat re-articulating themselves on the Palestinian struggle. And I do think we are in an era of desperation where it is very tempting to have a revolution for life, not as one that tries to build life and work from reproduction, from the labor of reproduction and care, and from the labor of regeneration and tending to nature, but have a struggle for life that copies the unhinged self-defense that goes along with property. So I think we now also do have a new a very kind of broad consensus in the left, both the woke and the anti-imperialist left, that I would say vulgar Fanonian, but that a Fanonian stance of, militant organized military violence is the way to go, and war is the template for social struggle. I actually don't feel at home there, but it's not me to the movements do what they do, and I can try to understand it. But I think that the kind of strategy of the revolution for life has changed, but it's still a revolution for life on the left. And that's now the first book. In a way, what I'm doing in the freedom book is less, it's not less political, but it's just doing one little thing, it's seeing that somehow a lot of the progress that would be so easy, that could be done even within the system, is always blocked with reference to freedom. And then it's just sort of saying, we can't give up freedom. Freedom can mean this other thing. Okay. And it can then also be an umbrella for lots of struggles. I do think this sort of rhetorics of staying is very potent for many struggles. Like it's for indigenous struggles to stay on the land, for ecological struggles that, for species to stay. Also, again, Middle East, I think it's about the freedom to stay. Also return, of course, but it's the freedom to stay, and of all people, not an ethno-national state, but I think you can articulate a lot of struggles through that.
Okay, and I have a second question. I have a lot of questions, but
I need to be close. We all need to speak less loud.
No, but we have until like 20 minutes more, something like that. Okay. About what you were just saying is like, how do you think the spatial dimension of liberty, or how are you thinking the relation between the spatial dimension of liberty and the temporal dimension? We need to get rid of, liberate that, abandon the idea, the spatial dimension, or they are complementary? Because I'm thinking in this word, to stay. To stay, it could mean to stay in a place and also to stay in time, like continue living, so how do you think, or if you can talk about how are you thinking the relationship between those dimensions?
Yeah, thank you. I'm definitely emphasizing the temporal here, and then you're always at the risk of losing the other. So I precisely don't want to get the space back in through the idea of staying, sort of everybody stays where they are. It's just a fact that many areas of the planet will be uninhabitable, and then the freedom to stay will be sort of, give freedom to arrive somewhere else. So it is really more the freedom to stay at all, and to stay in time, and to stay in social relations. I think the way that I try to think about time in a materialistic way, where all of nature, as it were, and also human practices are sort of matter in motion through time, I do bring back in space, because of course, like when I say an ecosystem is where all those tides intersect, or an institution is where social practices come together and need to be synchronized, then that is, of course, that's what makes a space. So in a way, I want to say that a kind of interlinking of lots of those temporal things, that's what space holds. Like space is where all the tides meet. And so then I think what makes it a very different notion from the liberal notion of space is that it's, living space. It's a space that is alive. And it's a space that is alive that gives us freedom, and not as in the possessive individual's imagination, the more dead the place is, the less it can the more free my will is. And the more alone I am, the more free I am. I mean, the book has a bit of a jokey chapter on Mars, this idea that you're free on Mars. No, you're free in a very kind of crowded Earth, you're free. Yeah, maybe I stop here and we go back with other questions.
Okay. So, ¿alguien más quiere hacer una pregunta? Se abre el micrófono.
Hay una pregunta de Gabriela,
Ajá.
la leo en el
Dale.
chat, y hay otra pregunta de Luisa. The Gabriela question said, what place does fear have in this process of revolution of freedom? If you want, Eva, I read the other question.
Yes, I'll reply to them all, of course.
Okay. You can read it. So, no?
Yes, the English one I can read. I can read the fear one and the Karen Barrett
The other one is in English also. The philosopher and physicist Karen Barrett speaks in a similar way about space-time as a materialization of reality and the possibility of regenerating multiple space temporalities as a practice of justice. In a world dominated by a universalist notion of time, the so-called contemporaneity, how could this proposal open up opportunities to participate in the materialization of diverse temporalities that make it possible to cooperate with other modes of existence in processes of regeneration and not only as a distinct mode of being in time?
Yeah, wow, wonderful questions. So I think that the fear one is so crucial. Thank you for that, because I really think, I mean, this is also something that you've probably seen the Nina Simone quote of that on the internet. What freedom means to me is no fear. And I think, or one way that when I'm asked to summarize the freedom to stay, then I often say the freedom to stay free without fear. So being somewhere where your life is not threatened. I think also that that sort of the not having fear is also something that, like, it's a question of why do you not have fear? It's not because you are brave, but you know that you will be helped, so the others are there to cooperate. I think that's also important in the how, like, there are bad ways, there are stoicist ways of getting rid of fear, and there are socialist or feminist ways of getting rid of fear. And that is because, like, the good way of overcoming fear is that the resources that you need will be granted to you. Like that's I think the vision I would have here. And yeah, I'm not sure we will ever be again in a world where there's no fear, but there will be a world where we can stay together and then feel freer to overcome our fear. And with the Karen Barrett question, well, look, I should probably this is a great suggestion to go back to her work. If I say what my prejudice from reading some of Karen Barrett is, and it's perhaps unfair. So I think Karen Barrett, in a very exciting way, sort of universalizes a certain type of temporality, this sort of crazy quantum physics type of temporality, across all regions of existence or life or the planet. And I am, in a way, much more old school and humanist, and I think that there are some temporalities that are distinct for humans. For instance, this way of having an understanding of your finitude, and also this way of having a very planned initiative of starting something new. And I do think we also need to cultivate those to be fully free. But I think in this realm of cyclical time, that we are so incredibly dumb about coordinating ourselves with the time of all other life. Like we are so, our modes of existence are destructive, but also they're very numb to the temporal needs of other creatures. And I think it's important that the freedom in this regenerative time, it's not just about do you have time, are the conditions met so that you can exist at all? It's also about, are you allowed to live and act in your own rhythm? And this is something that you don't need to be human and have self-consciousness in order to sense that difference. So, if you have Jason Moore's account of how chickens are fed and bred to maximum meat production, or if you have horse training in a commercial setting where that it just has to be fast, and you're breaking the time that something would take for itself to grow in a certain way or fulfill a certain task. We have that in our labor life all the time. Like often what ruins your work is not even what you have to do, but how you have to do it. So especially now with all the surveillance and digitization, and it's cut into little things, but also you always have to optimize, you always have to be faster. And sort of that makes it be completely unbearable, not even the having to do it at all. So I think if we had a better sense of what would be the free temporal rhythms of lots of different non-human human life, that could be a real reinvention of our life form. And I happened to have been yesterday in a lecture with and also spent time with Wendy Brown, whose work I adore. And she has a new line of work on listening and the sounds of life, and how all ecosystems also, like, they communicate. Even plants make noises to know whether there's a predator or which plant needs more nutrients. And so that made me think again that there's so much that we are so bad at communicating about the lifetime of different and non-human beings. And I think maybe this listening better would also be part of a liberation. But sorry, this was sort of now tangential. I switched from Baran to Brown because I know her better.
Well, we have some more questions, so I read it for you. This one is from Solvi. She says it's like the political dimension I mentioned before, and she says, I have another question. Oh, the first she says, thank you very much for your conference. How do you think the role of alliances in political struggle? I mean, who are the subjects that make up these movements? And I read the other one from Carolina Ramallo. Thanks, Eva. Your book, Revolution for Life, is wonderful. I'm a teacher and researcher of literary theory, and your contributions are very valuable to us of their theoretical rigor, feminist perspective, and hope. I hope I can read your next book very soon, since I'm researching on temporality in modern literature. Well, it was not a question, but a comment.
Well, yes, I think that makes me have the question of, if you come about, just send to me whatever you find about temporality in modern literature when you get the time to write it up, or I'd love to hear it. That's, I don't know whether you read German. We have a German literary theorist, I write her name here. She's crazy. She always writes those 700-page books. Eva Horn, she's just written a history of literature and sort of the seasons and natural time. But yeah, I'm just looking forward to what you come up with, and thank you so much. All of you can't imagine You know, when one is a writer, one is anyway, at least in my case, fulfilling a childhood wish, which, as we know from Freud, are the ones that matter for being happy. I mean, I quit academia, and I mean, because I didn't find it a good place to write, and also because I never dreamt of, I didn't even know there were professors when I was a child, but I knew there were books, and so I wanted to write books. But so great, I wrote books, then some people read them, that made me very happy. But the fact that they could be translated in languages that I don't speak was really something I didn't even expect. So it wasn't a childhood wish, but against Freud, I must say, this is what makes me the happiest. So thank you very much for hanging around here with me. Alliance and political struggle. Yes, let's get serious again. So I like to not speak of the subjects that make up the movements, even though I don't have a strong critique of the subject. I think there are many ways in which it's sensible to speak of the subject. But for me, the subject of a movement is more certain practices. It's what you do. And I think it allows you, I think we are in, at least in the movements I know, we have gotten into a very weird obsession with who can and cannot be an ally, and whether you're sort of on the right side or wrong side of a struggle. And I know that I think often there are sensible concerns behind that. And if you have people in a movement who, I don't know, take out all the other people's energy or care or, you know, dominate them or speak for them, or it's all a total mess. But I think one could sort of block this much better, not by saying you're not the kind of subject we want here, than by saying this is not the practice we accept here. You cannot do this misrepresentation, or you cannot do this silencing. But you know, you can stay. We love, like, there's always a part of you that is sort of an ally of our struggle. There's another part that isn't. So I think what I tried in the second half of Revolution for Life is to look at some practices that, to me, build something like the subject of revolution. And I do think that they are not just sort of general doing the right thing practices, but I think in the materialist tradition, we have this idea that to liberate something means to liberate, liberation in the first place means liberation through the self-activity of the collective in question. So for Marx, the liberation of humankind was happening through it. He thought the characteristic self-activity was production, so the liberation of humankind happens through production and productive practices, one could say. And in a way, that's much more important than whether it's the worker. I mean, it's working. Like, working is what makes the revolution. And in Revolution for Life, I think if one wanted to summarize it, then my take was that it's more reproduction that is the activity through which we can liberate, that we need to liberate, and that is itself liberating. Because in a kind of world where so much is broken, where that we have trauma, we also have understood that a lot of the residuals of toxins and trauma will not just go away. Then you need continual care work to enhance and increase liberty for all, but also it needs to be free work. And now sort of then still, I was bothered by how to properly think about the liberation in the domain of the domination of nature, other than just being like, oh, humans should be good and they should, you know, protect nature and be free nature. And I think there then the self-activity of nature is regeneration. So the labor of nature, it does restore life, but not in an intentional way, not like care work functions, but in a sort of non-intentional, evolutionarily balanced way. So then I think the subject of liberation is all the regenerative practices. And whoever does a regenerative practice then is thereby part of the revolutionary subject, and sometimes needs to be sort of defended against the part in themselves that undermines that regeneration. And of course, against the real enemy. I mean, but it sometimes helps to think that, even the heart attack of the bloody manager, it's somehow our ally, the manager isn't, but his striking heart sort of that says, I don't want this stressful life, so I don't want to fly every week. Like there's some cells in that body are already on our side. Yes.
Well, Eva, I'm going to ask for the rest of the participants if they have more questions. I have a little one, but we have 5 minutes to go.
We have a little time. Yes, of course. Bring it on.
Bueno, ¿alguien más quiere hacer alguna pregunta? Sí. Pueden escribirla, pueden levantar la mano, pueden intervenir. Si no, bueno, digo yo un par de cosas. When I first read your idea, your critique of property, I keep saying that it reminds me of something that maybe you don't know, but I'm telling you, it's about Argentina and the political,
yes, please.
Political movements in Argentina. Well, the first one is that in the 1949 Constitution, the Peronist Constitution, that was later abandoned and the coup d'etat of 1955 abandoned this constitution. There was an article that talked specifically about private property, and I will read some parts of this article to you. It says private property has a social function and consequently will be subject to the obligations established by law for the purposes of the common good. It is the responsibility of the state to supervise the distribution and use of the countryside and to intervene with the aim of developing and increasing its yield in the interests of the community and providing each farmer or farming family with the possibility of becoming the owner of the land they cultivate. So what I'm trying to say, even in the Peronist Argentina, or the Peronism has this critical position about property, and it looks property like a social in its social dimension, and it is interesting because the violence of the coup d'etat and the violence of the far right or the right in Argentina has to do with this vision of property. And in the Peronism, it was linked to the idea of social justice. The property, the social importance of justice, of property is linked with social justice. Just something to tell you about our history, or it may be interesting to you or for your work. It's not that kind of more deep critique that you do, but it's something that you can. I think it was important to mention that. And the second one, I will say now that you mentioned that there's like two parts of liberty in the space dimension, no? The will to do and the barriers to that will,
Yeah.
And
yeah.
nowadays it is interesting in the Millet's ideology that he keeps saying this, like how do you say something that you repeat
Mantra.
like a mantra. He has this mantra, and this mantra, if you I'm going to read it for you, it's like he mentions all the time the barriers for that will. It's like center in the barriers. I will read it to you. It says liberalism is the unrestricted respect for the life project of others based on the principle of non-aggression and the defense of the right to life, to live, the liberty and property. It's like when you mention that, it's like I remember this mantra because he repeats it all the time. His followers repeat it like it's a real mantra, like if like they're in church, you know. But it's interesting because this is an ideological phrase that also like how do you say it, like vanishes the idea that what they are really doing is using the will part of property, of freedom, or without any restrict, you know. The way they manage in public, what they say in public is just the other one part of this idea that you brought up today. So I wanted to know if in Germany you have this kind of trouble with arguing against the far right, you know, because the problem that we have now is that we can't find a proper way to argue with or to debate with the far right because of the importance that they have in in the social so not social media, but it's like Facebook, Twitter, you know, but also because we can find a way to fight their ideas, you know. I don't know if I've been clear.
Yes, and I mean, I also think sometimes one just cannot find the right way to fight, because like it's not always that we just need to have the right idea and then it works, you know. Sometimes the left is just too weak, you know, and those who find the right idea will be destroyed. And then like we still have the right idea, and that's the beauty, that we can look back on history and want to be on the side of Rosa Luxemburg, even though she was drowned and the right wing won out at that time, you know, that we'll never lose that. But so I don't think it's sort of a mistake in theory. It might be a mistake in reality that you don't win the fight. But of course, we need to spend all our time and all our brain to find ways to win the fight. And so what I would say is, when you say they are obsessed with the boundaries of property, but precisely not. So this is important, because what happens there is that this is actually different from the classic liberalism, where the crucial property is the self-ownership of everyone. And then comes other property, and it will be restricted so as to also not endanger the other person. But the new libertarian ideology often sets the actual property at the center. So the boundaries that are protected are the boundaries of the property, mostly the capital that is there. And then this protected property can wreak all sorts of havoc and destroy lots and lots of boundaries of the lives of individuals, because it's so protected and so encased that you cannot stop it, or you cannot, like, its boundaries are secured by the libertarian state. And I think the way that the ideology works is by the fantasy that one could at least have a little semblance of that protection, you know? If my will was a tiny, and if only the will would be a tiny bit, you know, encased in a sort of iron shell of that protection, that would be so good, you know? And I'd like all this other stuff. Yeah, the left promises me housing. Well, who knows whether they'll not mess up and whether the house will be dirty. And yeah, I can have equality, but you know, in the end, I'll probably be stupid and somebody else wins out and is cooler than me. But if I could have some part of my will sort of fortress, like the fortress of the big guy's property, like there's such a perfect blend of a big fantasy of power, and yet a totally inbuilt cynicism, that you're like, yes, it's tough, you know, it's a fight, I might lose, but at least we know what we're at, and that's the game, and we're not giving any kind of flowery promises that then will be kind of painful if they're broken. And we do have a very similar constellation here in Germany as well, also because, and I think it's even stronger in the former East, where there was such a neoliberal shock therapy, and in a very short time, this possessive individualism was introduced, and a lot of people were totally disoriented, really lost out, but they made the experience that the only thing that is secured is property. So you want to get your sort of share of the protection of the property. And, it's easy to see it in our enemies, but if we fight for abortion rights with the slogan, my body belongs to me, we are also seeking that protection. And I mean, hell, if it works, let's go for it. But it's not the anti-patriarchal revolution. The anti-patriarchal revolution would be that the whole grammar of me saying my belly belongs to me would be as absurd as a man saying that. You can't, no, you wouldn't, because it's not an object of ownership. Also, the current right is far too clever. This is not Germany, but it will soon come to Germany. But in Italy, Meloni, she doesn't argue at all in any Catholic way against abortion or she says, yes, of course, your belly belongs to you. But, we've closed all abortion clinics. So you can, if you have 5,000 euro and a car, then you can have an abortion. But also then the next step is to say, yes, your belly belongs to you. But, the embryo belongs to itself. So only because you own your garden, it doesn't allow you to shoot a child in your garden, right? So then you just they encase or codify their counter property, which then again wins out because it's where the power is invested. And I think actually one way of breaking that is, there are two ways. If you have time, I do think then this promise of being weak without fear is incredibly tempting. But we have such a difficult world and so little power that we can only in very sort of small contexts make that promise without it just being cynical. You can always say, oh, you should risk being weak, but oh, damn, then you're run over. That's not a good strategy. But so that's the kind of slow strategy. And I find it very interesting to see how, so if in my village has 52% vote for the fascist party, for the AfD. That's not, the German average is 20, but here in the East in the country. And the same men that are the total aggressive, cynic people, if you talk them in the right way, if they had 2 drinks, suddenly you get also to this infinite thirst for weakness that has been denied to them, especially in male company, and then all the kind of teasing and sadism that you sort of have also in those kind of hardworking lower class cultures, often especially. So that's a slow way, and we cannot give up on that, even though it's incredibly frustrating. The fast way, I think, is to say, look, we're the ones who give you property. You don't own anything. You should own more. You should own, like the law you quoted from Peron, you should own the land you're cultivating. You should own your house. We give you a car, just not that car, just a smaller car. So I do think the left always needs to remind everyone of the fact that there will be more property with us. And then, of course, then comes Eva von Redecker and says, oh, but it can't be property under full dominion. It has to be property that you are not allowed to abuse, because otherwise who protects the objects of property against their owners? But if we start that process with the big companies, we already make the world so much more ecological. We can, for instance, in Germany now, we have much, much tougher environmental protection laws in gardens than for the big companies. So the coal mining company can literally cut down an entire huge old growth forest. But if you have a tree that is bigger than 10 centimeters, you cannot cut it in your garden. I mean, that's ridiculous. You should say, especially people who have a small garden, what the hell? They can chainsaw everything, but protect, expropriate the big landowners and protect their forest. So yeah, that's, I think, also the deal with the devil property that we can risk making.
Well, Eva,
That was lovely. Thank you all so much.
well, thank you for that answer. Well, thank you for being with us tonight. Tonight for you, it's evening here in Argentina, and we are very glad. It was an honor to have you here in our university. So thank you, and we let you go. So you tomorrow, you have to travel tomorrow.
Thank
You have
you.
to rest, and well, we keep in touch.
Absolutely. Do send me stuff. I mean, I'm terrible with replying, but I will eventually reply. And I also then, when I have an occasion to use the stuff, then suddenly it keeps saying. So I'd love to hear how your conversations continue and what you're all working on.
Okay, we will send you.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye. Thank
Goodbye.
you again, Pablo, for
Thank you,
presiding
Eva.
over this so well. Bye. Thank you,
Bye.
Akela. Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. Have a good day.